Hello everybody and welcome. I am Michelle Scott from Total Compliance and I do some work with CILT in terms of women in logistics in the UK, arranging events. I also do some work for the East Midlands region with my husband Jonathan, who chairs the region, and we try and put on events, especially at the moment with the year that we've all had. So we're trying to put on a lot more live events and recorded events and pick out people in particular that seem to shine within the industry and can give a lot back to the industry. So today, as part of the interview series, I have asked Andrew Drewary along. I first came across Andrew some 2.5 years ago or so at the Falls conference when I sat there looking at him, listening to his talk about driver health, and thought, wow, this is somebody that's really switched on and that is going to make a great impact in the industry. And I've been following him online. I connected with him after that day. And then since then, I've heard him speaking at other events as well and thought this is the perfect person, especially as he's a fellow with the Institute, to get back here today. So welcome to Andrew. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me and thank you for that nice introduction.
All right, you're very welcome. It's very true. So, I just wanted to run through really about you and your whole sort of story. How did everything start with your road safety and all of the knowledge that you've got today?
Well, like probably a lot of other people out there, I sort of fell into the logistics industry. That was probably 20 years ago now, mainly because I'm a collision investigator by trade. So I've been plying that trade since 2001, as we're now in 2021, literally 20 years ago to the day, in fact. So primarily dealing work for insurers and solicitors, looking after typical civil cases, who's to blame, who should pay out, who shouldn't. And then as time materialised and the types of clients I was working with, they were nearly all the insurance I was working with at the time were for commercial fleets. So that sort of led me into this direction by default and really intrigued me because it's such a diverse area and a very complex area. And I think that's something that a lot of people in general public don't realise. And even what's gone on in the last 12 months, although drivers, warehouse people have been some of the heroes out there keeping the country going, people don't really understand what we do. This industry does and how it keeps the country flowing. And I got to a point where I think I got a little bit fed up, and I think I can be open and honest with that, a little bit fed up about the industry not necessarily taking the drivers as seriously as they should have done. Doing the investigations, it was always the driver's fault. And that's what the insurance wanted to know, whether they needed to pay out or not. But I think once you started drilling down and listening to the drivers a lot more, because I'm professionally trained as an interviewer for these type of interviews, when you listen to what the drivers say, the drivers have a lot of good things to say about what goes out on the road, but also about what their employers do well and what their employers could do a little bit better. So I approached an insurance brokers and they asked me to put something together and to start looking at things from a more safety perspective, instead of looking at it as a reactive measure that an investigation takes place. What can we learn from the investigations to put proactive measures in place to stop collisions happening, but also to understand exactly what things were affecting a driver that caused the collisions at the date and time that they happened. And for me, that presentation you saw was the very first time I'd done that presentation. So it was a bit of a punt doing a brand new presentation that I'd never practiced before in front of 600 people on the day. But the questions that I raised at that presentation, and we'll go into that a little bit more shortly, are questions that I ask as part of every investigation process. And I ask about the health and welfare of the driver, of their family, how things are at work, to understand what's going on at the time of a collision. And some of those things result in catastrophic collisions. Some of them, majority of them, are just minor incidents. But people find asking those questions really, really difficult. And that's why I entitled that presentation, Driver Health Asking the Awkward Questions. But I'm a professionally trained investigator. I used to be a benefits investigator in Liverpool 20 odd years ago. So as you can imagine, I was busy at that time. So interviewing drivers and asking really awkward questions is 100 times easier than dealing with benefit claimants. And I think people just need to, the industry need to find a way. We're talking a lot about mental health now, but really drilling down to understand who is working for them and what affects them on a day-to-day basis. So the last 6 years I've brought it into the road safety aspect of things, really understanding what's going on. And instead of saying to employers, your driver's to blame because of X, Y, and Z, it's not really your driver's fault, because did you realise all this was going on in the background? When was the last time you really spoke to your driver about it? So that's why I've moved into this area. I was fortunate enough to win the safety award for the CILT in 2016, which was great. And the product and the ideas I've had have really moved on since that time. And what I'm trying to do now is still engage with drivers for companies that don't really want to do it. But I'm trying to train and educate the management teams now to really look at these things. And as much as technology has been a really, really great advancement for the industry to understand what's going on and management of fleets, I think the biggest thing it's created is, I think it's widened the gap between the employer and the employee, because there's less discussion. And there's really only a discussion about when something goes wrong, not when it necessarily goes right and a driver's done something really well. We hear very few things of that, very few stories like that. So that's really been my passion, really, to move it on. And I think I'm doing quite a good job at it at the minute.
I think you are, actually, and I can really relate to what you've just said, because I do a lot of driver CPC training, and whether it be on in different courses, one of the FORCE courses that I do, the Safe Urban Driving, that relates to the driver, and some of the articles in that are perceived by the news as well, and how people don't understand the industry and everything involved. So what you've just said is just, I would say, 100% feedback that you get from drivers. Actually, they don't get appreciated as they should do, and actually they don't have people to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm phoning a company up to talk to them, and sometimes they just want to have a chat. There's no one there now. It's not that connection anymore.
No, there isn't. And I think that's where really understanding the drivers from the way I do investigations is probably the biggest thing to understand for transport managers and people who do that. I think a lot of people within companies who get tasked with doing the collision investigations don't really want to do it. They haven't got the time to do it. They haven't got the expertise to do it. My wife would probably disagree, but they don't necessarily listen to what's being said back to them from a driver. And I think that's the biggest thing in this area of health, driver health in particular. But when I interview drivers, 99.9% of my interviews are done over the phone. And there's a specific reason for that, is that it's non-confrontational. So the driver gets to choose when they speak to me. So if they are a tramper and they need to speak to me, I can speak to them at the end of the shift when they're parked up somewhere overnight, and I might be the only other person they speak to during that day that isn't a conversation with a family relative during the day. So half of the conversation I have will be about the trials and tribulations they've had during the day. How they've been not allowed to go to the toilet here, not allowed to go to the toilet there, that's frustrating, that makes them angry and makes them change the way they drive on the road, because they may drive quicker to get to the next stop to go to the toilet. There's always these knock-on effects. And I think let them have 10, 15 minutes just to blow off steam. And I learn so much. I can see exactly how a collision's happened because of what their demeanour is like over the phone. But by being on the phone, and is totally different to people say, well, do interviews by Zoom now. That's still face-to-face interview for drivers. and they can see me and they may not like the look of me. They may not like the way I sound. They may think, yes, I'm just one of those typical Scousers out there that's just big and brash and just talks. And I think the phone makes the driver confident to say, because there's nothing stopping them saying what they really want to say. And I think a lot more can be done in that respect for employers, just to have a phone call with a driver who's on an overnight stop. Just to say.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Sometimes my husband, he's class 1, and he'll go driving occasionally and have a night out. There's nothing that likes more to tell me about his day. He'll sit on the phone with me and like to talk about it. And so I can so relate to all of the things that you're saying. Just going back to when you did the conference then, those couple of years ago, did any other people contact you? Did it have because it had a real impact on me. It changed the way I did my training and the questions that I asked. Is there any other people have had anything come back to you?
There were. I had a number of enquiries, and yes, yourself, to a degree, you do these things to try and get some work in. But I think in those days I was not as savvy. I'm a road safety passionate about it, and I want to impart knowledge that helps people. And I had a couple of people come to me and said they made some inquiries, and they said they've advised people to do a couple of things within the groups that they work in. But it wasn't until 12 months later, I was doing another presentation in Bristol on exactly the same day the FORS conference was going on the following year. And one guy who was there on the day, we bumped into each other as we were walking out of British Aerospace Concorde Museum at the time. And I just said to him, did you find today useful? Because I did a presentation on driver fatigue that day. And how driver fatigue had affected me personally, and we can touch on that as part of this discussion. And he said, no, it was really, really interesting. Really interesting. He said, I've taken a lot from it today. And he looked at me and he said, did you speak at the FORS conference last year on driver health? I said, yes, I did. He said, I left that conference. He said, I look after 20 depots in I think it was the Southwest region, 200 and 300 odd drivers. And he said to me, I implemented a number of changes because of the things you said that day. And he said, within 3 months of those changes, we had 25 drivers, I think, come to him or within their management teams to self-declare medical issues or mental health issues. So for me, that day at FORS was a massive, massive bonus, because I could have saved knowingly 25 lives. But I think what was even nicer that day, I get a ping on my phone and the same gentleman will put a post on LinkedIn and said, I had a great day today. He said, I met a person who inspired me 12 months ago to make changes that worked. That made everything worthwhile.
Exactly that. And actually, Andrew, it's not just that, is it? Because it's the same when you do something like that. It's the ripple effect that you will have caused by that. So those 20 people, it's their families as well. And it's just that whole life-changing experience. So actually, well done. And I know what you mean. Sometimes we do things for one reason, but then something else happens and it makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
So how did driver fatigue affect yourself then?
So 4 years ago, my father got diagnosed with cancer. Usual story. 12 months later, got the all clear. Then 6 months later, it came back. And then he got diagnosed terminal cancer. So my wife and I were basically main carers for him and my mother, because they were both in their 80s. And after 12 months, my father passed away. And on the night he passed away, it was probably the first night I'd had a proper night's sleep in over 2 years. So when I did the FORS conference, that was at that was at the start of my father's illness. And then I thought, I was so relieved to get a night's sleep, and you think, you just take a deep breath and a sigh that it's over, because that was the best thing for my father at the time. And I went to bed the second night, woke up the following morning, and I just felt terrible. I'd had a full night's sleep and I just felt terrible. And each night kept having a decent night's sleep. And after a week or so, I just didn't feel any better. And after a couple of weeks, I went to a journey from my house to Selby, which is 2 hours away, to do a driver CPC training on driver safety. Did the 7-hour session, drove back, and I pulled up onto the drive, and I thought, I don't remember anything about that journey home. And in particular, once I got off the motorway to where I get to home was about 5 miles. The only thing I remember was looking at certain road signs and thinking, I can't see them properly. So I immediately stopped myself from driving. I went for an eye test, passed the eye test, still had the minimum standard to drive without glasses. But they said probably the stress of what's gone on with my father has had an effect with what's going on in my brain and that, and my eyesight. But I didn't feel confident driving. So I didn't drive for 3 or 4 weeks. And then I got back in the car and I did a journey for about 3 or 4 miles, and I still just didn't feel safe. So again, I pulled myself off driving. It was only after about 2 or 3 months I started again. Just short journeys, wouldn't do anything more than 5 or 10 miles. And I stuck to that for about probably 2 months, 2 months, then just slowly, gradually eased myself back into driving. So for me, and then the longest journey I did was to do that presentation at Bristol where I met the guy from Fours the year before. And that was the first time I'd done a journey over 3 hours in a 6 months period. But it's so difficult getting back behind the wheel of the car after being off the road for so long. And a lot of people will be going through that now with COVID. But what happened with me was my fatigue was initially acute because it happened straight away overnight, but it was prolonged in the effects thereafter. And it's only because I knew what the identifying features were, and go back to the story we started with at the Fours conference, only because I could ask myself the awkward questions. Was I safe to drive? And I could answer honestly that I stopped driving for a period of time. And I think what's going on now has affected so many people from a mental perspective, but also a health perspective, in that bereavement is one of the top 10 issues that worry commercial vehicle drivers. And I've had staff who've had bereavement in the past. And since my father died, I've looked back at myself and reassessed myself and thought, I was probably not the best employer at the time when that happened. And I should have done a lot more. So really, I want to put my experience out there as an individual from my own personal perspective as well as a professional perspective, that before you ask anybody else anything, you have to ask yourself those questions, and do what you should do for the right reasons, not because you think it's right, not because I can't afford to do it because I've got nothing else. Where will the money come from? The money won't come from anywhere if you kill somebody. So, and that's the underlying feature for me in this story from a safety perspective, really for the last 3 or 4 years. It's really being able to put the personal touch to it. And I use it in a lot of presentations now. First time I did it, yes, I almost broke down at the brake safety conference talking about it. But it gets easier, but it's always there. And it's probably been the biggest learning point I've had for myself in the last 2-3 years.
Thanks for sharing, because it's just, when you hear somebody's story about it, it makes things more real. And actually, you don't have to share those stories. People don't always want to, but it's so kind of you to share really that with the industry, because that itself can have an impact, can't it? And people don't necessarily, like you said, you've got that knowledge to ask those questions. However, when you're doing training and things like that, sometimes they can't even describe what fatigue is to you or know about it. And I say, how many times have you pulled the window down or turned the radio up or done something very simple, and they go, oh, well, yeah, I'm like, you've got the first signs of fatigue. And there's a lot out there now to talk about it. It's not a taboo subject like it was.
No, it's not. But I think for a lot of people, and I think my men find it more difficult to deal with, to personally, and probably male management find it more difficult to ask those questions because we're not particularly empathetic. Very few males are in touch with the feminine side of themselves. And I think it's something that comes easier to different people. But training is not always the thing, I think, Michelle, here. I think it's life skills that are the thing. And I'm just a lay person. I'm just a lay investigator. I'm not a forensic or expert witness. But I probably learn more than a forensic or expert witness would deal with doing the investigations because it's on a personal level. It's on a one-to-one. And fatigue in particular, we call the terminology is driver fatigue. The driver is fatigued, but it's not necessarily driving that's making them fatigued. And I think that's the point with my story. It was something away from work. It could be the kids have been up all night and the driver's tired before they even get in the vehicle in the morning. So they're not concentrating straight away. And I think one of the best analogies I continue to use, and I used it for the first time at FORS, when we look at fatigue and things like that, was if a driver smelt of alcohol, you wouldn't give them keys to the vehicle, and you'd do you'd do a DNA test on them. The driver smelt of drugs, you wouldn't give them the keys to the vehicle. The driver was yawning. Would you give them the keys to a vehicle? Probably yes. But you're not picking up on the telltale signs. If a driver was coming to start the shift with a can of energy drink, caffeine energy drink, would you question them? I would say 90% of the transport managers out there probably wouldn't question them. I wouldn't even think about it twice. But that's a telltale sign. Why are they having an energy drink at 7 o'clock in the morning when they should have been asleep all night? So why are we giving people the keys to the wagons when they're displaying quite obvious telltale signs? And I think that's a big question. I know it's business. I know it's time constraints. I know, and you run the fleet, you've got your own fleet and things like that. We've got to get things sorted. But COVID in for a most positive way has made people have to think about managing unexpected situations better. And if it means you can't give a driver a set of keys because you're not happy that they're yawning when they come into the yard or they've got the energy drink, you should make that decision without thinking about it now, because there's so many underlying potential things there that are the reason behind them doing it.
And I completely agree with you. Completely agree. We can sit here all day talking about this because honestly, I would talk about it for hours on end. And when you do driver health courses or anything like that, they look at you like, driver health, what are you going to talk about? And then you start in different topics and they're like, I never thought this was so much that you could cover. So it's really, really interesting. So what is next for you then? What's next on the agenda out of all of this wealth of knowledge that you've clearly got? We could sit here and put the world to
I think next on the agenda is, I think the education of the driver health. I think there's the big issue of the number of issues out there that are medical conditions that can affect a driver from having a driving license entitlement, which from a knock-on effect could invalidate your fleet insurance premium. So I think it's not just a safety issue in that respect, it is a business issue. So we all know about sleep apnea, and we all know about seizures and things like that can potentially take a occupational driver's license away from them. But I think employers have the duty of care to ask the drivers to go onto the DVLA website and look at the medical conditions that are listed there and say to them, if you've got any of those conditions, report them. Because there's only 28, 29, 30, just over, that actually affect your license entitlement. There's 164 that are mandatory reportable for drivers, regardless of whether it affects the driving ability or not. But by not reporting it, technically invalidates an insurance premium. And if the medical condition is then deemed to be a concern for a consideration for causing the collision, then the insurer has the ability and the right not to indemnify on that collision and reclaim the cost back from the company. So can a company really settle an insurance claim and have the money there? So it's a business thing. Health is the health of their employees is a business model as well. So that's the big education piece for me at this moment in time, which I'm spending a lot of time on, and making employers more aware of which ones they need to look at in particular. And probably for this session is high blood pressure. 30% of commercial vehicle drivers suffer with high blood pressure, but high blood pressure for a Class 2 license holder is mandatory reportable. So you've probably got 30% of drivers out there who are driving illegally, having not reported to the DVLA that they've got high blood pressure. So that's just a simple one. Forget all the others that can stop you driving. This one doesn't stop you driving. So I think that's where I'm really trying to steer now is there's no GDPR issue over this. It's a health and safety issue, comes under health and safety regulations at work. Is your employee fit to do the task you're asking them to do day in, day out? And what are you doing to ensure that they are fit to do the task? So that's the big drive for me. But I think also now is nearly all collisions are preventable. I always call them a collision. I don't call them an accident because an accident just happens, and there's not necessarily a reason behind an accident. A collision, there's always a reason behind a collision. It's one party, two party, could be three parties involved or more. Probably are the only few that aren't necessarily to blame for people. Responsibility is freak act of nature. But I think people need to look after the drivers more. Collision investigation, I think, should be seen as a must after every incident, regardless of whether there's a claim, whether anybody's injured or not, whether it's only a minor bump or not. Because an investigation should be, and the investigator like me should be seen as somebody's friend, because we're not trying to apportion blame. We're trying to understand so it doesn't happen again. And that will allow employers to change policies, processes, procedures to become proactive to manage risk instead of reactive to manage risk. So that's my big challenge at the minute. That's my next stepping stone at this moment in time is learn from your mistakes. And people like me are out there to help people do it because you know yourself, Michelle, running a fleet's a 24/7 job for everybody involved in the industry, and road safety and managing and looking after your staff doesn't cost money. If it's done properly, it saves money. And I had that with the award that I won in 2016. The case study I put forward was helping a guy manage a fleet of 400 vehicles, and in 15 months we saved them £1.2 million. And they only invested £35,000 in me. So they had a 20-to-1 return, if not more, on investment because we could quantify everything we did. And any changes that were made were quantifiable because of the new processes we put in place. It wasn't a case of, well, I thought he said this, or I thought she said that, or I thought he meant this. It was fact. Everything was written down, and you could come away and take a step back. And I think being independent as an investigator takes the conflict away from the workplace. So transport manager may not like the driver he's interviewing today, and it'll cloud the judgment on what decisions are made. So that's my next big stepping stone.
Fantastic. And it is a fantastic stepping stone as well because it's so needed in the industry. We've come a long way, I feel, but there's such a long way to go now. So we've come the tiniest bit on the road, and there's a whole way ahead, isn't there, really?
There is.
That's fantastic. So where can people find you, Andrew, to connect with you online?
They can connect with me online at Twitter, just as Drewary. LinkedIn, just put my name in like you have in the past. And the screensaver at the back. I've got websites, my own small business website, www.roadsafetysmart.co.uk.
That's fantastic, thank you. And you can connect with me as well online, and I'm connected to you on LinkedIn, definitely. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview today. And this interview will be put online so everybody can see it. So if you've got any questions for Andrew, I'm sure you can message him on LinkedIn or Twitter and he'll get back to you. And we really wish you all the best for your future with the road safety.
Thank you.